Hi there, for today's video we are going to continue reviewing fantasy. Fantasy stories have made up events that could not really happen, okay? So we have characters, setting, events. The characters, they're not found in real life. They do amazing things. Animals talk and act like people. Then the setting. The setting is where and when the story takes place. It is unusual. For example, maybe it's up in the clouds, maybe it's underwater, maybe it's in a flying castle. That's unusual. That would not really happen, right? And then the events. The events could not happen in real life. The problem is solved in an unusual way, and the stories make believe. When you think of fantasy, remember, you use your imagination. You can be as creative as you want, okay? So what I'd like to do is, now that we've gone over fantasy and we know it's make-believe, it's not real, it's not going to happen in today's world, I have some little sentences and I want you to do this activity with me. So if I give you a sentence and you think it is fantasy, you are going to stand up. If you think the sentence I read is not fantasy, you think it's realism, meaning it seems real, it could happen, then you'll sit. So for example, a cow jumped over the moon. Would you stand for fantasy or would you sit for realism? Does it seem fake, make-believe, or does it seem like it could happen? A cow jumped over the moon. I hope you are standing. That is fantasy. It is make-believe, okay? So that's just an example. I'm not going to be standing. I will tell you what the answer is at the end, but let's go ahead and get started. Our next sentence is, I eat cookies with milk. Is that fantasy or is it realism? Remember, you stand for fantasy and sit for realism. I eat cookies with milk. That is realism. That could really happen, right? Our next sentence. It's important to get to school on time. It's important to get to school on time. Is that sentence fantasy or realism? Is it fake, make-believe, or does it seem real? What do you think? I hope you're sitting in your chair because that is an example of realism. All right, our next sentence is, my dog did my homework for me. My dog did my homework for me. Is that fantasy or realism? Is it fake, make-believe, or does it seem real? You're either standing for fantasy or sitting for realism. I hope you are standing because that is fantasy. Your dog cannot do your homework for you, can they? No. All right. Next sentence. This spider was so tired it slept on its pillow with its blanket. Again, this spider was so tired it slept on its pillow with its blanket. Is that fantasy? Stand up for fantasy, or is it realism? You stay seated. Fantasy or realism? I hope you're standing because that is fantasy. That is make-believe. That cannot happen. Spiders do not nap with a pillow and a blanket. That is make-believe. All right, our next sentence. I like to read before I go to bed. I like to read before I go to bed. Is that an example of fantasy or realism? You stand up for fantasy, sit for realism. I like to read before I go to bed. I hope you're sitting in your chair because that sentence is realism. That can happen. You can read before you go to bed. All right, our next sentence. I like to eat at Whataburger. I like to eat at Whataburger. Is that sentence an example of fantasy or realism? Fantasy is fake, it's made up. Realism, it could happen, it seems real. I hope you are sitting in your seat because that sentence is realism. It could happen. It does seem real. All right, our next sentence. I flew to school and drifted over the clouds while I looked at everyone else walking. Again, I flew to school and drifted over the clouds while I looked at everyone else walking. Is that sentence an example of fantasy or realism? I hope you are standing. That sentence is fantasy. You cannot fly over your school and float through the clouds and look at everyone else walking. That can't happen. That is make-believe. All right, the next sentence. The dragon blew its fiery breath on my goldfish. The dragon blew its fiery breath on my goldfish. Is that sentence an example of fantasy or realism? Fantasy is fake, make-believe. Realism, it seems real. It could really happen. I hope you are standing up for fantasy because that cannot happen. Dragons don't exist. All right, our next sentence. The little girl enjoyed spending time with her parents. The little girl enjoyed spending time with her parents. Is that sentence an example of fantasy or realism? Does that sentence seem like it's made up or fake? Or can it actually happen? Does it seem real? All right, I hope you're sitting in your chair because that's an example of realism. All right, I hope you enjoyed that little activity with us standing up and sitting down. And I hope you have a better understanding of fantasy. Remember, fantasy. Go ahead and say that word. Good job. Fantasy stories have made up events that could not really happen. So right here, this is a picture from Jack and the Beanstalk with the giant. They don't exist. You're not going to have magical beans that make beanstalks. That is made up. That is fantasy. All right, I hope you enjoyed today's little review over fantasy.